how do you understand trust? When I say trust you, where does that lead you?
Okay, so for me, I'm an economist. I'm an economist who is, sort of professionally interested in the intangibles, the stuff that really matters, which is also hard to nail down. So well-being, trust, this sort of stuff. I'm also heavily focused on measurement, so I tend to collapse back to measures. Fundamentally, when I think of trust, I come at it two ways. Firstly, I think of it as economists as the best measure we have of social capital, right? And by social capital, which is a word that gets used to label about 3 or 4 completely different and almost unrelated things, what I really mean here is the productive stuff that exists between people rather than within people. So I'm an economist. You think a little bit of resources, the resources that are used to make wealth in a traditional economic sense, and the resources that are used to make sort of non-market outcomes, the elements of broader well-being. So if you start dividing those up, you have natural capital, which is stuff that exists whether we're there or not. Produced capital, which is stuff that we've made. Human capital, which is stuff that's embodied in us as individuals, and social capital, which is stuff that exists between us, only in groups, thinking as productive resources. And so the obvious difference between human capital and social capital is that we're having this interview on other sides of the world. If I moved to work where you're working, I would bring my human capital with me, but I would basically have to use the local social capital, the assumptions about how other people behave, norms and values. And the crucial one, I think the best general measure we have of social capital is trust. Whether when I go out and I interact with someone with whom I do not know, whether I can do so in confidence that that relationship will play out in a way that is both safe and mutually beneficial. There's a whole dimension of whole literature in development economics on the drivers of development that I look at, and I find I'm quite skeptical. People argue about whether it's institutions or deep historical cultural things that drive development or trust. These are the same thing, right? These are people looking at different bits of the same thing. Trust is a measure that reflects institutions. I mean, the crazy thing about institutions is you look at half of the most dysfunctional states on the planet, they have what are essentially photocopies of the Constitution of the UK or France or the USA. In principle, on paper, they have the same institutions. They don't function even remotely the same. And a lot generalized trust in others, which is what I am most interested in and what I think is the most useful general measure of trust, I think basically is a really useful short form measure for the heuristic that people use to make decisions about how to interact with others, and for the socially productive whole lot of different small things about how we work as an institute, we work as groups.
When someone asks you to define what trust is, how do you? Let me step back. My understanding of trust is that can be experienced interpersonally between you and I.
Yeah.
Okay. And it can be understood so that's interpersonally, of course. Then it can be understood in broader groups, say teams or organizations, and then socially. But when it comes to the trust between myself, Dominic, and Conal, how do you reflect that in
trust? Trust. I mean, to me, trust. If you ask for a definition, to me, trust generally is the expectation that another person with whom you're going to interact can be expected to behave in a socially constructive manner, in a positive manner.
Okay.
So it's the expectation of positive behavior.
Yeah.
And note that trust is inherently an expectation, right? If you've observed someone after the thing is over, trust is irrelevant. The fact that you've interacted with someone and have a reason for trusting them to me, doesn't undermine the fact that it's trust, right? I might have had 100 interactions with you. You've always been utterly untrustworthy, and then I have good basis not to trust you now.
Yeah.
But it's still the decision to trust. It can be based on a whole lot of things, but ultimately it's when I think, Dominic, if I do something with him, how is he going to behave? It's that expectation. So it's saying something about my beliefs about another person.
Yeah, it's an invitation in a way to be vulnerable. In other words, we can't really experience trust with each other without vulnerability.
Two things here. I mean, I think obviously if it's someone you're looking for their track record of past behavior, okay, either with you or with others. But the other thing, and I think this drives a lot of geographic variation and trust across countries, across cultures, is it is also actually the expectations. This is one of the, so there is this circle between institutions and trust. If institutions are trustworthy and non-corrupt, then I can go out and I can take a risk in my interaction with you that you might not be trustworthy, because if I have to go to the institutions to sort out the resulting mess, I have confidence that they will do it. So I think it's very much you're using cues both about the other person and also about the institution. And one of the things I think you look at variations between societies are those that are relatively, can I use the word closed? I don't think it's the right term. I've no doubt sociologists have a good term for this. But where the networks are closed, where really you can only trust networks of people for whom you have that track record of experience of their behavior, and for anyone outside that you have to be very, very careful, or societies where the institutions are sufficiently effective, not because of what's written on paper, but largely because those institutions are made up of people who have a series of assumptions about how other people will behave, but where those institutions are highly functional and reliable, in which case I can take a much bigger risk with people I don't know.
So if we can manage to do that, if we can manage to bring trust back to the table, what then happens? So we now have trust at our social table or our interpersonal table. What are the implications?
So trust explains everything. Trust is immensely important in explaining why some countries are rich and why some countries aren't. There's a quote all the way back. Adam Smith observes this. Basically, the more trustworthy people are, the more things you can do, the more sort of mutually beneficial exchanges that can be made without somebody expropriating it or running off, or you losing everything. There's no surprise there. When you look at the non-market aspects of well-being, right, trust is actually also incredibly important there. And this is different because you look at the other capital stocks, that doesn't apply to them. So human capital is important for both market and non-market. Social capital, trust, which uses a measure, important for market or non-market. Produced capital, much less relevant for non-market, has a much smaller impact. So yeah, trust matters for everything. It matters for all. It's one of the key determinants of human well-being. And it does so, I think, fundamentally for two or three reasons. One is obviously the space it opens up for positive interactions with others, right? The wider you can go, A, there's just more win-win games. B, if you're confident you can go elsewhere, it's actually much harder for someone to kind of get himself a position at the top of a patron-client network where you, right? Because actually, even though you don't know that other person over there, you can walk away and take a risk. So it gives lots of exit strategies. I think it's a pretty direct driver in and of itself, right? People worry a lot. A high trust society is a society where you have to devote a lot less of your attention about worrying about untrustworthy people around you.
Trust seems to be, I mean, in the literature and the research, trust is nested in this thing called well-being, right? So if I was to ask you equally, that what is well-being, how does an economist answer that?
Okay, so whenever I answer this question, people always say, well, for a well-being economist, you seem awfully unsure about it. So there are several answers here. The most useless one is well-being is what an economist means when they talk about utility or welfare. Both words are unhelpful. Utility because it's way too technical. and welfare, because it was actually a perfect word for this.
Yeah.
But in the 30s, we started labeling government assistance welfare, and so it doesn't mean the same thing anymore. It means to me either the ability to live a good life or the experience of living a good life. And those are the two key definitions. You have Amartya Sen saying it's about your freedom to live a life you have reason to value, your ability to live a good life. And it's the freedom that matters. If for any reason you were happy but didn't have much freedom, well, you're wrong. You may be happy, but you're deluded. You don't have high well-being. The other end, the sort of neo-utilitarian end, say actually it's about the internal experience. That's the important thing. This is an argument which is of absolutely no consequence, right? There may be individuals somewhere who live in these deluded states, but when you look at aggregates, like what's going on at a national or a city level, the things that drive all the drivers of positive experiences that people have are the same things that come up under lists of the ability to live a good life. There's actually not a lot there. So I don't really care whether it's your freedom to live a good life, which obviously means some control over material resources, good health, living in a society where you have the opportunity for positive interactions with other people, because to slightly, actually there's an accurate quote from him. What Aristotle said was not man is a political animal. He said man is a polis dwelling, man is a city dwelling animal, by which he meant essentially we are social creatures. Some money, health, social interaction, control over your own destiny matters a lot, right? Actual procedural issues. Quality of the natural environment matters directly, safety. And you can already see how a lot of these things lead back either directly or indirectly into trust. The other way you can think about well-being is a sense of satisfaction with your life, happiness, meaning and purpose in life. Some people get hung up on the philosophical distinction between these two things.
Yeah.
To me, they always point in exactly the same direction. I just don't care that much.
Dr. Smith, you're known to say that trust explains everything. What does an economist mean when trust explains everything? Is there some sort of unifying theory of everything?
Yeah, there sort of is. I think unifying is actually, so the standard explains everything because there are two or three different approaches that you throw this up. So in development economics, when you're just looking at why some countries are rich and why some aren't, trust is an incredibly powerful predictor of differences in trust across countries. I think the actual phrase, I think I stole, it's not my phrase, I actually think it's David Halpin's in the British Cabinet Office. But it also explains a lot of variation at the small area level. For me, I mean, I particularly focus, because I've spent quite a lot of my time recently on measuring well-being, and the standard approach to trying to do that in a way that takes intergenerational sustainability issues seriously is to do this call it the capital stocks model usually, which just says, look, well-being is well-being that you experience now, and we can describe that. We can look at how either measure people's satisfaction, or we can look at how wealthy, healthy, socially connected they are, and we can look at the distribution of that because they're real people now. But if we're concerned about sustainability, that doesn't just mean caring about the environment. What it actually means is thinking about future generations. And the environment matters there, because if we fuck it up, excuse my language, now it won't be there for future generations. And the problem is we can't measure the well-being of future generations directly because we don't know what they're going to want or how they're going to use things or what distribution is going to be. So we measure well-being now, we can't measure it in the future. But what we can do is look at the things used to produce well-being, those capital stocks, produced capital, natural capital, human capital, and social capital, and say, look, provided we're handing on to the next generation an aggregate stock of those capitals that is no smaller than we have, then they have the same ability to pursue well-being. So it's kind of a direct implementation of the or interpretation, not interpretation of the Brundtland definition of sustainable development, development that meets the needs of today without sacrificing the needs of tomorrow.
Yeah.
So when I say the thing I most focus on in this is when it drives all the different elements of well-being that you would want to measure.
Yeah.
Right. It's one of the big four things that really, really matter.
Yeah. If trust is this incredibly powerful thing, which the research and the literature very strongly indicate, that I'm fascinated to know how we can accelerate. I don't know if that's a word that an academic would use, but accelerate trust in cities, within the four walls of a city, for the purposes of accelerating the futures that we want. Okay. How do we do that? How do we accelerate trust in the city setting?
So this is where it gets really, really difficult. The first answer to that is I don't think we have any idea. Because one of the things that we have manifestly failed to do is figure out how to take societies, particularly from low trust to high trust societies, but even back the other way easily. Yeah, there do tend to be two equilibria that you get trapped in. A high trust society is quite resilient, and I have a caveat there, in that it actually takes a critical mass to break out of that pattern of behavior. Because if you just try and do it on your own, all the other trustworthy people are going to mark you out as untrustworthy and ignore you.
Yeah.
But
quickly, what does that mass look like? What does it take? What is that? You said there's a critical mass to break out of that virtuous cycle. What is it? Is there a percentage? How much?
Facebook will do it.
Okay. Okay.
Facebook is a technology designed to destroy trust, basically. Okay. I could elaborate on that, but that's the gist of it.
Okay.
We don't have a technology design that is as effective to build trust going back the other way. I think it's really slow, hard work. I suspect trust is one of those kind of things, lifetimes to build, seconds to maybe not seconds, but months or years to destroy.
So your work to date has been predominantly the measure of trust, as opposed to how to foster.
The measure of trust and its importance as a driver of other outcomes at the national, primarily a national and subnational level. Less on how to foster it. And it just is less, I think, on how to foster it, particularly at an aggregate level.
Let's go to the land of magic wands for a moment. If you had a magic wand and you could use that magic wand to build trust or to foster trust within the four city walls, so to speak, how would you wave that wand? What would you do with it?
So, okay. This is only semi-serious, but there's a little bit of serious in the semi. The best recipe I've seen, I think, for urban design is you need a couple of feudal warlords with a pack of thugs. You leave them next to your city for 3 or 4 centuries, so your city is forced to literally build walls around and defend itself, and then organically evolve an internal layout for 3 or 4 centuries. After that, you get rid of city walls and the feudal thugs, because they're definitely not helpful. But the core layout you're left with, I think, is actually really good. There is something about it's an observation, actually, living in New Zealand cities, which are very, very badly designed by and large. They just sprawl over land. I mean, some of them, Auckland, I think, is one of the worst designed cities in the world. And looking at some of the, living in France, actually, which has some really beautiful urban spaces, less for me the big city, the big sort of planned bit of Paris, but often the smaller towns and villages. And I think there is something that works quite well, saying, have your space, have it quite constrained, and then let it evolve for a while in a natural way over time. So you end up with things that are a little bit quirky, a little bit odd, but also surprisingly livable.
On the other side of the wall, you have a feudal savage warlord who's you need to protect yourself against. So that's node number one. Node number two is this massive wall across which and through which you protect yourself. And then the other node is this ecosystem inside the wall. So broadly speaking, three nodes, right? The walls are now gone. The warlords have perished or they've come to their senses, one of the two. And you have this community and it has evolved using your language. What does it look like?
So walkable, dense but not homogeneous, I think, is one of the things which, you know, when I, like I said, so it's dense, but it's not everything the same size, the same style. I think constrained space also often helps to focus. So when you have infinite space, you're tempted to show status in your house because we are a creature that seeks status through size, which takes very little imagination and you know, I think some horrible examples of McMansions. When you're stuck with constrained space, you look for other ways to show status. So you get buildings that are just more visually attractive, right? And which the other thing actually, this is again, this is something I have you push me to areas I've no evidence for. But one of the other observations that strikes me that a lot of the cities which I think are most livable for is that status, there is value, there's actually real value in status being shown on the outside of your house, rather than being focused heavily on the inside. So you get a lot of architecture now which is designed to look great on the inside and is essentially a stack of square boxes on the outside. It doesn't really make any serious attempt to try and deal with the rest of it. So it forces, and if I'm stretching it here, but for trust, it tells you that you're living inside away from other people, right? So it's everything is about, this is good for within my little wall or fortress. It's not externally. When I look at the architecture and the cities which I like, actually the spaces inside, you know, they're fine, but they're often smaller. It's the outward facing public spaces where the effort has gone. And that again forces you outside, and it's consistent. I don't know, I suspect it's not a terribly strong driver of trust in and of itself, but it's consistent with an ethos that sort of values more the social connections rather than I'm going to kind of sit behind my walls and
well, it's kind of the equivalent of as the architectural equivalent, well, turning it's the architectural equivalent of what we get from literature, which is you know, don't trust a book by its cover, but what you're actually saying is trust a book by its cover.
I think there is a lot in so it's not trust in its cover, it's that actually for cities and for cities where you want to trust, there is a lot going on outside the house or outside buildings rather than within them.
Okay.
The trust is about interactions between people, and if all your attention is focused on what's going on inside, you're probably not thinking about the features which drive trust.
To city leaders, what are the three major impediments or challenges that they are likely to experience with the absence of social trust?
Well, for one thing, they won't be able to get anything done. Right, resources will, as social trust collapses, the functioning of your institutions collapses too. So as it falls a bit, you have to spend more effort on monitoring. As it collapses, you actually begin to be unable to get things done, and in particular, you become unable to keep things maintained. So even if you get something built, ultimately, whatever resources you're allocating to maintain it end up going somewhere else. That's the first thing. That's from a direct function of government thing. The second thing you're going to notice is that the economy performs noticeably worse in two ways. One, people, low trust environment, people can't start things up, they can't start new things. Looking at New Zealand recently, so it's the role of trust and productivity in New Zealand. Yeah, one observation there is that New Zealand is a really, really high trust country in global standards. And when you think about it, part of what's going on there, and matters quite a lot to New Zealand, is when, and we're a long way from anywhere, right? 3.5 hours on a plane, and you're still over open ocean, basically. You haven't even got to Australia, and there's nothing there. Nothing in Australia.
Not even Australia.
Yeah. The distances in the South Pacific are really big. So you think about that. How does trust function? Trust actually makes New Zealand closer to other places. If you think of, you're in Germany or France or the UK, you're a business and you're looking at expanding overseas, locating a plant or something to do something, you might have a choice. You can go to a nameless, corrupt country in Eastern Europe, right, which is going to be close. Airfares are going to be cheap, and your staff aren't going to spend too much time traveling there, but they're going to have to go there a lot in order to make sure that what you want to make sure happens and keeps happening. Or you do a deal with a high trust country further away. To go there, it's a day and a half, 36 hours on a plane. You're knocked out for time afterwards, and it's expensive, but you don't have to be there all the time because it's actually going to. So it acts. I mean, you can think of trust. A good one way to think of trust, I think, for a city leader, it acts almost as distance to other people. So it's one of your real distance, the distance that matters in terms of the economy, but also in terms of the non-economic things. It's partly a function of miles, but it's also partly a function of trust. And if you were just using a heuristic for this and saying, okay, what does trust do? Trust makes me closer to other people. Other cities, imagine somebody's picking your city up and moving it to the middle of the Pacific Ocean, right? It's going to actually raise similar sorts of issues in the long term. A lot of the benefits that you got from being very, very close to people will just wither away because trust functions as a kind of distance.
What are the top 3 benefits that city leaders will enjoy if they manage to bring trust back to the table?
One, it's going to drive down all your social costs, right? So high trust is directly going to contribute to low crime, better health, all of this sort of stuff. Well, secondly, it'll make it easier to get things done, not just for you, but things will happen on their own. So an active civil society both creates trust, but it also thrives on trust, right? There's no point to me going out and starting up a movement to clean up my neighborhood if there's a high likelihood that any resources we collect for that are going to be siphoned off by someone to go somewhere else, or just that, none of my neighbors are going to, my neighbors are just going to use it as a chance to dump extra rubbish on the street. Right. There's a whole lot of so it actually creates space for you to do less and for other things to flourish, and it creates a healthier society in that sense.
We've been talking about social trust, which is the biggest stuff, but I'm reminded of, is it Sufi? Sufi said something like, it's a pity we look to the branches where we should be looking to the roots. And there's another much more contemporary saying, and I know it well enough just to get to the point of it, and that is the quality of an intervention has everything to do with the interior condition of the intervener. Okay. So if we take those 2 reflections as an exhortation for us to look inside before we come to build the social trust, what to your mind, let's cut away all the data and all the literature if we can to your academic mind, and I was to ask you, how does the individual earn trust? What makes a person trustworthy?
Behaving in a trustworthy manner. I think that is really, it's that simple. But I mean, if trust is the expectation of positive behavior in others, then behave positively. I mean, you want to go back to literature, the golden rule in every religion: do not do. I was at the OECD. I was doing on a mission to Israel, and there was a quote up there from it's on a wall, so I'm going to put up from a famous rabbi. It's probably a really famous quote, but I'd never seen it before. But I was quite like it. It was the golden rule. So, do not do unto others anything that you would not have them do unto you. That is the whole of the Torah. Everything else is just commentary. Right. So that's the obvious thing for trust as well. Behave in a trustworthy manner. There is one other thing that was triggered in my mind though when you said this and thinking about it internally. So the other thing, and I apologize, it's anecdata, but there have been these trust experiments with wallets dropped on the street in different cities. And of course, the thing that comes out with this is not only the bulk of them returned, but in every city, while the proportion that are returned varies and matches in the same pattern that trust varies across countries, in every city, the proportion that is returned is higher than people expect, much higher.
Wow.
So trust works in predicting the number of what's returned, but actually, even in high trust, both in high trust and in low trust countries, people are actually more trustworthy than we expect they are. Yeah. And I don't know how you leverage that to get into that virtuous circle, but there is something
there. Our expectations of each other. Conal, thank you. Thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it. I know it's late there for you.
Yep. What time is it where you are?
5 to 12 in the afternoon. Well, in the morning.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And you're 9. What's the time for you now?
Just on 11 p.m.
All right. Okay. So the way that this time zone punishes your time zone, the West Coast of America punishes my time zone, and I do a lot of work on the West Coast. So I feel your pain right now. Thanks very much.
Oh, this isn't too bad. I was just giving a paper to a symposium in the UK, which giving a paper at 2 a.m. in the morning via Zoom.